The morning she came to the Coldwater property, the sky was the color of old pewter, and the creek had already started to freeze along the edges. She had taken the stage from Lethbridge, and before that a train from somewhere she didn't talk about. The driver had set her trunk down on the road without being asked and pulled away before the dust had settled. She stood there a moment, looking at the gate. The hinge on the left side had rusted through. Someone had looped a piece of wire around the post to keep it from dragging, but the wire had been looped wrong, and the gate still dragged. She lifted it as she pushed it open. The house was set back from the road about 200 yards. She walked the distance and counted what she saw. Fence line on the south pasture had 3 posts leaning. The water trough near the barn had a crack running from the rim down toward the base. Old damage, nothing recent. And someone had packed mud into it as a temporary fix. The mud had dried and started to crumble. The trough was still holding, but not for long. There was a dog. It came around the side of the barn and stopped when it saw her. It didn't bark. It just stood there, watching, the way a dog watches when it isn't sure yet whether a thing is worth the effort. She held out her hand. The dog came to her slowly, then pressed its nose against her palm. She'd known dogs like that before. Dogs that had learned caution the slow way. The man came out of the barn a few minutes later, wiping his hands on a rag that wasn't doing much good. He stopped when he saw her standing in the yard. He was taller than she'd expected from the letter, and thinner. There was something careful about the way he held himself, the way a person holds themselves when something hurts and they've decided not to mention it. He said her name like a question. She said yes. She said she'd come on the morning stage, passed her at the road as if checking whether anyone else had arrived with her. There was no one. She watched him understand that and settle into it. He showed her to the house. The porch boards were soft in 2 places near the door. She felt them give under her weight and made note of it. Inside, the kitchen was cold. The stove was iron, a good make, but the firebox had been left open and the heat had bled out overnight. There was ash on the grate that should have been cleared days ago. She looked at the ash. She looked at the window over the sink, where the light was coming in flat and gray. She said, "The stove's been running cold." He said he hadn't been in the house much this week. She didn't ask where he'd been instead. She crossed to the stove, cleared the ash, found the wood box near the back door, and laid a new fire. Her hands knew the motions. They had always known the motions. The man stood near the door and watched her. She could feel him trying to decide something. She gave him time. There was a woman in town, a Mrs. Halloran, the letter had mentioned her, who had arranged the introduction through the church directory. The letter had described the property as a working cattle operation with strong bones. She had read that phrase twice. Strong bones. It was the kind of thing people wrote when they meant, it has been better than this. He had 41 head, the letter had said. She would count them later herself. Fire caught. She stood up and turned around. She said, "I'd like to see the rest of the property before the light goes." He said, "Now?" She said, "If you don't mind." He didn't mind. She could see that. He looked almost relieved, the way people look when someone else has decided to start. They walked the south pasture first. The fence she'd noticed from the road was worse up close, not just the posts, but 2 sections of wire that had been mended with the wrong gauge and would give under pressure. The grass in the near field had been grazed low, too low and too evenly, which meant the cattle hadn't been rotated. They'd been left on the same ground too long. She asked, "When did you last move them to the north field?" He thought about it. He said, "October, maybe, before the cold came in." She nodded. She didn't say what she was thinking, which was that October was too long ago, that the ground needed rest, that you could see in the way the soil had compacted near the gate, where the cattle had stood waiting, that this had been the pattern for more than one season. She was thinking, someone gave up on this place before he did. Someone let things slide and then left, and he's been trying to hold the shape of it ever since without enough hands and without enough heart for it. She was thinking, I have seen this before. The barn was better than the outside suggested. The roof had a gap on the northwest corner. She could see light coming through in one thin line near the ridge. But the structure was sound, The posts were plumb, and whoever had built it to last. There were 12 stalls, 8 of them in use, with fresh enough bedding that he'd been in here this morning at least. She asked about the milking schedule. He said he was down to 2 dairy cows, morning and evening. He said one of the hired men had left in August and the other had gone in November, and he hadn't replaced either of them. She said, "So, you've been doing it alone?" He said, "Mostly." She looked at the near stall where a brown and white cow stood blinking slowly at them. The animal looked healthy. That was something. Whatever else had gone undone. The cattle had been fed and watered and the sick ones seen to. She could tell that without asking. She said, "The trough out front has a crack. You'll lose it before spring if you don't repack it." He said he knew. She said the fence on the south side needs work before you move them back. Said he knew that too. She waited. He looked at her for a moment and then looked away. He said, "I know what needs doing, He stopped, he said. "There's more of it than there used to be." She understood that. She understood exactly that. She had come from a farm outside of Pincher Creek, a place her family had worked for 2 generations before the drought came and took the third. She had been the last one left on the property when the bank came. She had watched a man from the bank walk through her father's house and write things down in a ledger with a very small pencil. And she had stood in the kitchen doorway and kept her face still and said nothing because there was nothing to say. She did not tell the man at Coldwater any of this. She told him about the fence. She said, 2 of the posts on the south line need pulling and resetting. The mended sections should be replaced, not patched again, if you have the wire. He said he had the wire. She said, "Good. We can start on that tomorrow if the ground isn't frozen hard." He looked at her again. That same look, trying to understand what kind of person arrived at a stranger's failing property in November and started making a list. She looked back at him steadily. She had learned that steadiness the same way the dog had learned its caution. The slow way. The only way. They did not speak much at supper. He had put a pot of beans on some time before she arrived, and they were cooked through, which she noted. There was bread, a little stale. She didn't mention the bread. He asked about her journey. She told him the parts that were easy to tell. The train from Calgary, the wait in Lethbridge, the stage road that ran east before it turned south and left her wondering whether the driver had taken a wrong turn on purpose. He almost smiled at that. She watched him almost smile and looked back at her bowl. The arrangement had been set out in the letters clearly enough. She would manage the house and help with the cattle work through the winter. In the spring, they would decide. Halloran had written that the man, his name was in the letters, but she had taken to thinking of him simply as the man at Coldwater, because it helped her to keep her footing, was decent and hard-working, and had fallen on a difficult season. Mrs. Halloran's had a gift for understatement. After supper, she washed the dishes and he went back to the barn. She could see the lantern light through the small window above the sink, moving slowly, the way lantern light moves when someone is walking between stalls, checking on things. She dried her hands and stood at the window for a moment. The dog had come inside and was lying near the stove. She looked down at it. She said, "You've got the right idea." The dog's tail moved once. The ground was not frozen hard the next morning. They started on the south fence before breakfast. She had found a pair of work gloves in the porch that almost fit, and she wore them, and she did not explain herself. He had the post driver, and she worked the wire while he set the posts, and they found a rhythm without discussing it, which was, she had learned, how you found out whether a thing was going to work. It was going to work. He drove the posts straight and didn't rush it. He knew how to read the ground. She watched his hands while he worked and could see the knowledge in them. This was not a man who didn't know farming. This was a man who had lost his footing somewhere along the way and hadn't quite found it again. She asked, without looking up from the wire. "How long have you been here?" he said. 11 years. He said his wife had been with him for 6 of them. She didn't ask about the wife. She didn't need to. There were small signs of a woman's hand in the house, a curtain in the bedroom window, a quilt folded at the foot of the bed in the spare room, a hook by the door at exactly the right height for a woman hanging her coat, and then the absence of any other signs. A woman who had been and was no longer. The shape of her remained, but the living of her had stopped. She understood that too. She stretched the wire to the new post and wrapped it and said, "The calves you've got in the near stall. Are you keeping them for breeding?" He said one of them. He said the other he'd planned to sell in the spring but hadn't decided on the price yet, she said. "The brown one will bring more. The markings are better." He stopped what he was doing and looked at her. She said, "I used to help my uncle with his cattle before." She didn't say before what. He didn't ask. They finished the south fence that day. It took until the light was gone. She made supper from what was in the house, potatoes and the last of the salt pork, and he ate 2 full plates and said it was good. She thought, well, that's something. The weeks moved the way weeks do in a place that demands you be in your body and not in your head. There were always cattle to check and water to break from ice and fires to lay, and the small, endless maintenance of a working property in winter. She moved through it steadily. She had always been better when there was work to hold her. He had a system. She could see that after the first week. It was not her system, and some of it she would have done differently, but it was a system built over years of living on this land. And she respected that. She did not suggest changes without reason. When she did suggest them, she did it plainly and let him decide. He usually agreed. After the 3rd week, sometimes he agreed before she finished the sentence. She found the ledger in the 2nd drawer of the desk in the front room, looking for a pencil. She hadn't meant to look at it, but it was open, and the numbers were there, in a hand that was careful but discouraged. The handwriting of someone who had kept records, because they knew they should, not because they believed the numbers would come out right. She sat down and looked at them anyway. He came in from outside and found her there. He stopped in the doorway. She said, "I'm sorry, I wasn't. I was looking for a pencil." He said it was all right. He came over and stood beside her and looked at the ledger too. She said, "You sold 17 head in September." He said, "Yes. But the feed costs from August are higher then." He said, "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "The price on the spring calves if the brown one brings what I think." He said it might not be enough. She said, "No, but it's closer than it looks in here." He looked at her. "Cunt." She said, "The north field needs to rest until March, but if you rotate them in April and the grass comes in the way it came in last year." She'd looked at the field. She could see the old growth pattern in it, a good field, a field that wanted to be useful. "You'll have enough for the summer on less supplemental feed. That changes the number." He was quiet for a long time, she said. "I'm not saying it's simple," he said. "I know you're not." She closed the ledger and put it back in the drawer. She found the pencil under a folded piece of paper and held it up. He almost smiled again. She was beginning to expect those almost smiles. The way you begin to expect a creek to run after the snow, not guaranteed, but worth looking for. January was cold in a way that made the walls creak. She had grown up with prairie cold, and she knew the particular voice of it. The way the wind came in under the door, despite the rug. The way the horse's breath in the morning was the first thing you saw before you saw the horse. She was not afraid of it. She was not much afraid of things anymore. The catter. Fear had been something she'd had room for once, when there was enough of everything else. She woke one morning in the last week of January and knew immediately that something was wrong with the cattle. She didn't know how she knew. A sound, maybe, or the absence of one. But she was dressed and out the door before she'd finished deciding to go. He was already in the barn. One of the cows was down. She came in and saw the animal on its side, breathing in a way that wasn't right, and she saw him kneeling beside it, his hand on the animal's neck. She asked, "How long?" He said, "I don't know. I heard her around 3. She looked at the cow's eyes, its gums, the way it was lying. She said, "It's not pneumonia." She said, "Does she bloat?" He said, "She has before." She said, "Do you have the trocar?" He did. She'd seen it in the tack room. She went and got it without being asked, and she came back, and they worked on the animal together for the next 2 hours. Her holding the lamp when he needed it, him talking to the cow in a low, steady voice while they worked. And slowly, in the way of things that might go either way, the cow came back. She stood up finally and put her hands in the small of her back and stretched. He was still kneeling on the ground. He looked up at her. He said, "Thank you." She said, she'll need watching for the next few days. He said, I know. He said, I know, but… She looked at him. She said, you were already here. He said, you knew what to do. She said, so did you. He looked at her for a moment, not the way he'd been looking at her the past weeks, reading her like something he was trying to understand, but differently, more quietly. Then he looked back at the cow, who was breathing better now, lying more naturally. It's been a hard few years, she said. Yes. He said, I wasn't sure I was going to be able to. He stopped. He tried again. He said, I wasn't sure about any of it. She said, I know. She did know. She had seen it from the gate that first day in the wire looped wrong on the hinge. You loop something wrong when you are in a hurry, or when you are tired, or when you have stopped quite believing that the result matters. She had seen it in the ash in the firebox and the crumbling mud in the trough. Not a lazy man. Not an incompetent man. A man who had let himself believe the work was not worth doing carefully, because he had not yet decided whether the life was. She had decided without saying it that her job was not to tell him otherwise. Her job was to do the work carefully enough that he could see it being done. February came, and the cold lifted a little, the way it does sometimes in the middle of winter, 1 week of deceptive warmth that fools no one but is welcome anyway. She started work on the kitchen garden. There wasn't much she could do yet. The ground was still too hard, but she cleared the old growth and turned the beds near the south wall, where the sun would hit first, and broke up the worst of the compacted soil along the fence line. He came and found her there one afternoon, stood at the edge of the garden and watched her work for a while. He said, you don't have to do that, she said. I know, she said. The beds haven't been worked in a couple of years. He said, no. She said, so what did she grow here? A pause, he said. Carrots, mostly, some squash. Onions, she said. I'll put in the same then. She could hear him standing there behind her, and she kept working, giving him space to be quiet in the way she'd learned to give him space, because he was a man who needed to arrive at things in his own time. After a while, he said, she would have liked you. She stopped what she was doing. She let the word settle. She said, that's a kind thing to say, he said. It's a true thing. She didn't turn around. She started working again, her hands in the cold soil, the sun low and pale over the barn roof. After a while, she heard him walk back toward the house. She held that sentence carefully for the rest of the afternoon. She turned it over in her mind the way you turn over good soil, not rushing it, not asking it to be more than it was. It was enough. The brown calf sold in April for more than he'd hoped and less than she'd predicted, which was close enough. The fence held through the worst of the mud season. The north field came in green and strong, the way she'd thought it would. She'd learned to read a field the same way you read a person, by what it showed you when it wasn't trying to show you anything. She stayed through the calving and through the first cutting of hay. She stayed through the long light of the summer evenings, when the work didn't stop because the light didn't stop. And through the first cold nights of autumn, when they sat on the porch without speaking and watched the sky go dark in colors that didn't have names. She was not the same person who had come through that gate in November, one hand steadying it against the drag of the broken hinge. She was not lesser or greater. She thought sometimes, late, when the house was quiet and the dog was asleep by the stove. She was more like herself than she had been in years. As if the work of this place, the daily specific demand of it, had given her back to herself a piece at a time. The hinge had been fixed in February. He'd done it without mentioning it, and she had noticed without mentioning it, and that too had been enough. He asked her in October. He asked her quietly, without preamble, one morning before the milking, standing in the barn, with the light coming sideways through the gap in the northwest corner, which he had also fixed in September on a day when the weather was good for it. She looked at him, at the barn, the repaired roof, the clean stalls, the cattle that were healthy and settled and beginning to look like a herd again rather than a collection of animals waiting to see what happened next. She said, yes. She said it the way she did most things, plainly, without ceremony, because the ceremony had already happened. It had been happening for months, in the careful daily accumulation of everything they had done and not done, and understood without saying. The dog came in from outside and pressed against her leg. She put her hand on its head. Outside, the Coldwater property lay quiet. In the autumn morning, the south fence straight, the garden beds turned and mulched and ready for the cold, the fields rested and restored and waiting, as good land does, to be asked again what it could give.